I'm Chris Butler, Assistant Vice President, Global Head of Product Operations at Cognizant. I'm here to talk to you about how we can escape the calendar gridlock for training and how do we get really great product teams to learn together from each other. My background includes places like Microsoft, Facebook, Waze, and Kayak in both product management and business development roles. I was brought on as the head of product operations at Cognizant earlier this year. And the reason why I was brought on is really to make our product managers as effective as possible. Now, when first getting started, my goals for this particular role were three things. One, to reduce attrition. Two, to get consistency in leveling on the PM ladder for all of our individual associates. And then three, create a baseline for PM training. So the first thing I did was create a skills matrix, of course. And it captured things that were hard skills, all the way to soft skills, to even more intangible things that I think really make product managers effective in their day-to-day jobs. And when talking with a lot of senior management around the group, we started to think about how would we get people to really get good at all of these different skills. And we came to a conclusion that getting about 10% of a person's time committed to learning on a regular basis was a good goal for this. And of course, when I started to socialize these types of goals, I got a lot of pushback and kind of concern from the individual associates that were on our team. And part of the reason why was because when they think about training, they think about something like this. This is a company's code of conduct training module where you probably watch a few videos, maybe an example case, you'll read through a lot of text, and then you'll have to do some quizzes that are then graded. And people don't find this type of training very effective. They don't find it very helpful. Because in the end, does it really change your behavior in a way? Most of the time, people are just basing this off of logic that they already use or knowledge that they already have. And that's not the only way they think about it, right? They also think about this idea of workshopping within larger groups where there is interaction. There's some way that there's exercises they can participate in, but it still ends up taking a lot of time. Some of these training courses will start at 1 hour to 2 hours in time for a particular topic, but could be days of time away from their actual projects to actually learn something like this. When I first started getting acclimated to the team, I started looking at all the different meetings that were already taking place, just to see where there may have been some type of waste in the calendar or time that we can make more efficient for them. And the first stop was really these council meetings. And so council meetings, what they are is a 30-minute meeting between a particular product person, an associate that's on a client project or engagement, with all of their product management leadership. So people that were their managers, and even myself as the head of product operations to talk to them about the project that they're on. This included a couple things from the outset. So first, there was a slide deck that would be prepared usually the night before, that included a bunch of information. And so that would be things like, what is the problem or outcome we're trying to go for, if we knew what it was. The OKRs that a product manager would then create for their particular engagement. Different staffing changes, people that were coming on the project, going off the project, opportunities for expanding our engagement with that particular client, and many, many more things. And this slide deck took an hour, maybe a couple of hours to actually prepare on a once-a-month basis. And we would then take the time during this 30-minute meeting to walk through all of those slides. And unfortunately, there was not much room for very much else. We would go through these slides, and then we maybe have a minute or two to be able to discuss any of the challenges that were brought up. And when starting to attend all these different meetings, I was talking to a person about a particular associate leaving, and they had said that one of the reasons that they cited for leaving was actually these council meetings. And so that was something that took me aback and definitely made me want to think about, what are we doing wrong with these council meetings when they could be a really, really great meeting? And so one of the things we tried then was to change the way the council meeting worked. And what we did was we still made it about a 30-minute meeting between that product person and their leadership once a month. But we stripped out all of the different status aspects, and we really focused in on what are the challenges that they're having at that point. And not only that challenge, but like, what is the following up on the challenges that we talked about the last meeting? And so now that we were able to really structure this in some way around that challenge, what we found was that people, after they would have this new type of meeting, this new council meeting, they found it was the most valuable meeting, council meeting in particular, that they had had ever. And so we knew we were onto something. And so what that meant was that through these processes, we're actually providing a lot of information to people. We're talking to them about how, more senior leadership would be working through something. They would talk about the way that they would work through something. And it made me wonder, how do we actually end up taking these times that is work that we do on a regular basis, these meetings, and how do we make our training more like this work? So that it's not only something that you have to take your time out of the day for, but also to then, how do we make it just part of our day in some way? So I thought this was a really key question for me. So first, I'd like to stop for a moment to really identify some inspirations that brought us to this point and really helped with this epiphany about making the training that we do more like work. The first one is really Kolb's experiential learning cycle. So this is something that people use in training circles to be able to understand, how do we take something like a concrete experience, allow people to reflect on it, abstract some of the things, the concepts out of that they may find for value for later, and then allow for active experimentation for the next experience to be able to do that. So this idea of repeatability, basing it on experiences, was really, really important. The next aspect was taking a lot of the work from Sharon Bowman around the idea of teaching from the back of the room. And in particular, the 6 trumps, there's a few that were really, I think, valuable when we talk about how we integrate these things when it comes to training into our regular lives. And so the first thing was really a lot about talking trumps listening, and not just the idea that the person who is, say, in the council meeting talking about things, but also for them to be able to hear and have leadership talk through the problems with them, I thought would be very valuable. I thought that shorter trumps longer was very important. How do we have lots and lots of these experiences over many, many, many different times throughout the week, throughout the month, for people to get a possibility for engagement? And then finally, different trumps same. So this idea of how do we start to inject this type of learning in almost every meeting that we have, rather than just very particular meetings around training. The next aspect was Emily Weber's work around communities of practice, and in particular, making sure that we understand that the goal of a community of practice, and being the steward of a community of practice as the head of product operations, is not just to spread explicit knowledge, things that people can learn by actually going to a book and reading them, listening to a lecture or something like that, but all this other implicit, tacit knowledge that hides under the surface that we really want to get everybody to get experience with. When we talk about like PMs gaining experience, it really comes down to how do they over time build that tacit knowledge. And so how do we actually shortcut with low overhead the ability for tacit knowledge to be transferred within our organization? And then finally, there are lots of different routes. In a talk that Emily Weber gave about skills liquidity and skills gaps, it doesn't just have to be training, right? It can be self-directed, it can be through coaching and mentoring, it can be through communities of practice. There's many, many different ways that we can all learn something and we can upskill ourselves. And so taking that as like an inspiration for this, it meant that we should try to apply learning and feedback to as many of these different circumstances as possible. And so when we start thinking about the mechanisms for learning and the mechanisms for feedback within inside an organization, I think about it really across 2 different axes. One is how public or personal is this particular feedback? Is it something that there's a lot of people that are involved? Is it part of a team? Or is it something that is more private and personal to one person? And then the second thing is, are we looking to the past or are we looking to the future? Right? Are we really trying to understand and analyze what we've already done? Or are we trying to like play through what if scenarios, how would different people react in this situation? And the hypothesis that we have is that the best meetings for making learning look like work are ones that are semi-public meetings that tend to deal with things about the future, either the present or the future. And so from this, we created a 2x2, of course, because we're consultants, around the scale from personal to public and past to future. And then we mapped a bunch of these different meetings that we already have that tend to deal with feedback or could potentially deal with feedback in some way. And so there's a bunch of these on here that you have probably done before, like retros, postmortems. Those are ideally things that are part of your regular practice. And then there's other things, though, that may not be as familiar to you, which I'd like to go over today. And those 4 things in particular, I want to talk a bit more about councils and how they're structured. I want to talk about this idea of topic mobbing, which is something we're stealing from engineering to then use for how to provide just-in-time tacit knowledge transfer. We're going to talk a little bit about the idea of scenario planning for far future types of strategic discussions. And then finally, simulation and wargaming, which is something we're experimenting with right now. So first, councils. It's also something that I would refer to as critiques. In a previous life, we didn't have the concept of councils where there would be an individual meeting about each of the projects that a PM was on, but we did find time as a team to actually do critiques where someone would bring some work to the team to then talk about it. And so I'm going to use this term interchangeably of councils or critiques because I feel like there's a similar thing. It's a group of PMs that are getting together to give each other feedback. And the real key thing is to how do we focus in on the learning around a particular challenge that a person is having, rather than just something that is hypothetical or theoretical. And so one of the really key aspects of this was how do we actually provide for a meeting that is mostly focused on that discussion, so that senior PMs can give advice and ask important questions to these other PMs. And vice versa, how do we invite other people that are not even on this particular project to guest in these council meetings to ask questions? And so what we did is we did it in a very purposeful way around how we structure the type of information. And so first of all, the follow-up from the last meeting is really key. How do we keep this kind of accountability of a challenge is presented here, there should be some type of follow-up. It is, of course, up to the person, but it's something for us to quickly recap. And then we have them present a challenge, and we do it in a time-boxed way. And the reason why we do it in a time-boxed way is, one, I think all PMs should get really good at summarizing the outcome that they're trying to go after and give the important information. But it's also because we want to preserve the rest of the time for actually that discussion. So you can see here that we spend a majority of our time actually in a discussion rather than in recapping or overviewing the challenge that we're talking about. And in particular, there is a way that both presenters and then the people that are critiquers or leadership in that meeting should be acting. The first thing about presenters is that they're not really there to do a sales pitch, right? They're not trying to convince anybody of anything. In fact, it's usually those leaders should not be trying to be convinced of anything, right? They should be talking less when it comes to asking, they should be responding to questions, but they shouldn't be monopolizing the conversation. It is up to them to then lead with a list of information, right? And then finally, it's up to them to decide of that feedback what they actually take. I think one of the key things about feedback mechanisms in general is that this should not be something that gets put in your permanent record. It should be a very safe space that you're going to then decide what you do about this, right? And I think that is a key to delegation when it comes to managers and employees. And then the leaders, they're the ones that really should be giving critique, but not criticism, right? This is not about negativity. This is about like trying to understand and make something better together. And in particular, you should be talking about the work, not the person. There should be more questions than assertions, right? Like you should be asking about context. You should be asking about framing. You should be asking about what did they consider? And then I think it's really important to realize that just because some of these people may be more senior product managers in the organization, it doesn't matter what they like or dislike, right? The person who's actually closest to the information is the presenter. And so they should respect that. And then finally, when it comes to the idea of asking more questions, we should try to not product in the meeting itself. We can always offer suggestions. We can offer techniques or processes to potentially use. But the idea of going through and doing, say, a prioritization exercise right in that meeting, this is not the appropriate place. The fact that there does need to be a prioritization meeting is the one that's really important. So that's it for critiques. Topic mapping is something that I think is a really interesting possibility that we're just starting to explore at Cognizant. This is really to help answer a question right now in that I need some help with some type of related topic and a very particular topic. And so this is actually, of course, stolen from the idea of mobbing within the engineering community. And so mobbing is really there. It's almost like pair programming to the nth degree. So rather than just being one person with a keyboard and one person watching or interacting, there's actually one person with a keyboard and then multiple people all getting together to be navigators while one person drives. And the real value here is that you're getting kind of everybody talking together from their different viewpoints to actually implement something. And so there's a lot of advantages to doing this in the engineering community. The way that we've started to consider this within the product management community is actually inside of the playbook that we're building. So this is part of our SharePoint site that includes a bunch of other things, lots of reference materials around career, hiring, anything to do with our procedures or enablement, but also this section around a playbook, which includes a bunch of different topics. And each of these topics, say product mindset, we have a short synopsis of kind of what is our starting point for this topic within Cognizant. And then we have a bunch of reference materials. In this particular case, we include things about kind of 5 whys. We include outcome over output discussions and videos. And this is meant to be a jumping off point. Now, when people have gone through all of these materials, they've actually read through this introductory kind of paragraph about this, they may have more questions. So for example, let's say that someone wanted to create a product mindset training for one of our clients. If they came to this page, they found some information, but they had some type of particular nuance that they wanted to work through with someone, we have something on the side here, which are really these stewards. And there's only one here, but there could be multiple of them. And those are all people that are incredibly passionate or experienced in this particular topic. And so rather than just the idea of me going from this piece of information, this set of information, and then having to go on my own, or when we were in offices, maybe walking around and asking someone or randomly talking to someone at the water cooler to be able to get some additional help, I can actually now go and post something to our internal teams group, in this case, around product mindset workshops, and then tag the people that are stewards on this topic as well. Because part of what being a steward of this topic is it not only helps you contribute to your community, which we have, kind of performance expectations around, but it also now allows me to jump in and help this person immediately. The worst thing possible is for a particular question to happen in the community and for it not to be answered, because there's no one that is in particular is part of their job. So I think this is a very, very powerful way to get mobbing for product managers for topics that are not just coding. And so moving on from topic mobbing, I want to talk a bit about scenario planning. And scenario planning is a really interesting technique for looking to the far future of our strategy. And the type of question or issue that will be brought up usually when we talk about scenario planning is, what would you do in this particular case? It's not just the idea of like me as the product manager, what would I do in this particular scenario, but also to be able to do this across many different people, both senior and junior, to see how they would react in those circumstances. And so the way that you first start with scenario planning is to really try to understand all of the different uncertainties that you have in your product today, and then pick 2 of them. And so once you pick 2 of them, you can then, of course, put it back into a 2x2, which makes all of us consultants feel very comfortable. But what you're looking to do is that for each of the quadrants of this particular 2x2, what would happen if you had more of uncertainty 1 and more of uncertainty 2? In the upper right-hand corner? Or what if you had less of uncertainty 2 and uncertainty 1 in the lower left-hand corner? And you're able to then create a set of scenarios that you should usually name, you should add a bunch of information, and you can start to consider, how prepared are we for these scenarios? How might we actually act differently if that was the scenario? And do that across not only for an individual PM, but also across the entire team. And so as an example of this, let's say that we were a hypothetical video streaming platform. And this platform has to deal with 2 uncertainties within their future. One is about the amount of time that people will spend watching. As COVID starts to ideally go away, people are able to go outside and do other activities that are competitive to watching or binge watching at home. Maybe there will be more watching, maybe there will be less. But then there's also this idea that because of the way the internet works, people have started to maybe move away from the idea of mainstream broadcast TV into more niche tastes. And so what we can do is we can now graph these 4 different scenarios based on a combination of these 2 uncertainties. And so the first one, if we talk about the idea of more niche taste plus more watching, we can start to consider, what would this mean for a video streaming service when it comes to lots of content with lower quality standards potentially? Once we start going around the quadrants now, if we had more watching but more mainstream tapes, we probably want to focus in on some really big shows that would be available for repeats. So like The Office or Friends or something like that. When it comes to more mainstream taste but with less watching, maybe we want to go after high quality shows that people only ever expect to watch once. And then finally, when we talk about more niche tastes but less watching, maybe we take our budget and we actually amplify the amount that of quality that we're putting into each of these highly targeted segments that are going to be very, very rabid fan bases. And so you can see here that there's 4 scenarios that we just considered. There may be very different ways that someone that is a group product manager would assess this versus a more junior one. And so this is a very interesting conversation to have, because what we're doing now is we're transferring knowledge between each other about how might we actually react in this future world that could take place. And so that's why it's really key that what we're really asking here is, what would all of you do in this particular potential case? And so how do we start to learn from that? Now that we've talked about scenario planning, I'd like to now focus in on something called wargaming, which is also talked about as simulation or other types of methodologies to allow for people to kind of reactively plan something. And so this is really to help answer the question for most people: how would you react to this particular thing happening? And how would we do that over many different steps? And so this is something that comes from originally the military in the 19th century. There were games that were created by the Prussian military that really focused in on how would you do troop movements. And so while it wasn't particularly strategic at a very high theater level, it was very tactical in the sense of how would a commander get better at learning what would happen, especially in the fog of war, when a particular situation would start to play out, especially against an enemy that's not necessarily someone that's going to pull their punches. So you can see here they're talking about some type of simulation, looks like focused on Northern Europe. So I think wargaming is really applicable to the way that product managers learn and work. First of all, product managers need to deal with an enormous amount of uncertainty. And that uncertainty is something that through experience we can become more comfortable with. Next, we need to consider different decision-making processes when it comes to proactive versus reactive decision-making. And then when it comes to focus, prioritization, and time management, we really need to understand how are we doing this with our teams and how are we changing the way we do these things as we start to move down through a particular pathway. And then finally, the idea of end order effects. So just because you make a decision right now, being able to start to see around corners or understand what that particular decision could do in the best case and the worst case could be very interesting for a product manager and very helpful for them to understand. So I've created a little bit of a game that we're experimenting with right now that steals an awful lot from Wardley mapping. So you'll see that I have a value chain here. It's loosely kind of leveled from the user down to particular things. I'm not using the aspects of kind of genesis to commodity that Wardley mapping is using. And then I've added two things at the very top where we have basically the team and the landscape as kind of components that you could be focusing on. And so when I say team here, it really is how well are we working with our team? When I talk about landscape, I mean competitive, understanding trends in the market. This could be interpreted as like betting on something when it comes to user research. And then what we have here is this is for a hypothetical video streaming service where there is a viewer. The problems that they have maybe is to find something to watch or to start content quickly without having to choose a lot of things. And from there, we have a couple different solutions that could be possible. So the little chits here are really meant to represent the focus or time that the product manager is going to put on any one of these things. And so what they'll do is they'll put them sometimes in multiples on different aspects of this, right? And with the mechanism of this particular game related to the draw a card section is that there are going to be random events that are happening. And then based on how you actually end up focusing on particular aspects of this game board, you'll either be able to adapt or you won't. And so this game is supposed to be something that helps take place over multiple terms, so you can understand how a confluence of factors may put you in a very different place than you would have otherwise. And this draw card, again, steals very heavily from the different types of doctrines from Wardley mapping and ends up being a randomization. There are also some draw card decks that we're working with where there are team events, different types of competitive events, things that are more specific, but it's something we're still experimenting with a lot. And so in the first round, let's say round 0, I actually end up assigning chits to things that I think I would focus on. And so in the real world, this would be that, I am actually a product manager that is maybe focused on the problem, finding something to watch. I am heavily focused on my team. I'm not so focused on outside trends. And then I look at certain problems that I would be working on in some capacity, either in the case of finding something to watch, I'm very heavily focused on that, whereas starting content quickly, maybe it's something I'm less focused on. So now that we've kind of laid out the board, let's take the first random event to see how that might impact us. And so in this case, I've drawn from a particular type of doctrine, which is around components, is that no single method fits all. And so in this case, really what we're trying to talk about is how would this change? How would I be able to now adapt based on what I've focused on? And how would I not be able to adapt on that? And then what would I do next? So in this case, if no single method fits all, This idea of like recommendations for communities, which I have bet on inside of the problem of finding something to watch, may not be valid anymore. And so should I be moving this away from the particular feature that we've been building? Does that mean I need to sunset it? Does that mean that we need to consider this? And so, you know, the time frame that we're talking about here on every turn is not necessarily like minutes or hours or days or even weeks. It could be months. And so this means that the recs for communities could be something that I need to change a little bit. So we go one more card now. And I've actually drawn from the doctrine the prediction component, which is really around economy has cycles. So from this perspective, there's actually two different things that could be impacted now that we're talking about it. One is that if the economy has cycles, I could interpret this as that outside groups, when it comes to either content production or the way that competitors end up focusing on certain types of content, ends up changing in the way that, you know, over time. And it could be seasonality, it could be cyclical from the standpoint of going to more novelty style approaches. But the other thing too is that this idea of now pick up where I left off, maybe I made the right choice to not fixate on this, because if there are cycles, maybe the facts, you know, at a very micro tactical level, maybe me picking up at the last show I left off is actually not true. Maybe it's that I'm going to be rotating through a lot of different shows as the different type of cycles end up proceeding through. And so I think this is like a very interesting way. It's basically a tool, not only for ourselves, right? What is actually the way that we want to start to think through these possible implications of a strategy that we choose, but also what does that mean when we start to compare that with other people that are on our team to do this. And so in conclusion, I really want to see how everybody can make their training more like regular work, taking people out of their context and going off to do something that is very hypothetical or theoretical. It rarely causes true behavior change. And so I really would push everybody here to try to make their training look more like regular work. And in particular, there are three ways that I've found that this can take place. So one is that you replace your meetings with things that are much more interactive. They're more about feedback. And so that means taking things that should actually be asynchronous, like status, just-in-time reporting, things like that, and move them into the async status bucket. The next thing is to restructure, right? We need to be able to structure these meetings around a key experience or challenge so that people can compare notes. Without that ability to compare them and without the structure to actually allow them to do that comparison, they're never going to do it. And then finally, repeating these things over and over and over again across many different audiences, across many different timeframes, I think really ends up building a very interesting kind of like texture and tapestry of experiences and tacit knowledge transfer that will make everybody better overall. And as a template, I think I would really ask you to think about these common meetings that happen inside of product management orgs on a regular basis and see what you can replace there. So one, weekly status meetings. Can we replace these with councils or critique meetings and move all the other status stuff to some type of async mechanism? When it comes to PM all hands, can we start to talk through different scenarios around uncertainties that we're considering right now? For strategy reviews, can we start to do wargaming sessions based on that strategy? And then finally, water cooler chats. Can we turn this into something that's more deliberate with mopping? And so thank you so much for the time today. I really hope you found this valuable. And I would love to talk with all of you and love to hear about your questions about the way that we've started to apply this at Cognizant and also at my past roles. Thank you very much.